beyond the men, the leaders, the people in our election for president, there is a single issue. There is one issue that is driving voters from across the world, and that issue is immigration. If we take a quick look back into history, not too far distant past, 2016, the UK votes to leave the European Union. Brexit, as it is known, is driven largely by the British common man, the working man, the forgotten man of Britain, who's looked around at his country and has seen refugees and asylum claims and illegal and legal immigration and says, I no longer recognize Britain. It's impacted his workforce. It's impacted his social services, his public services. It's impacted crime. And not insignificantly, it's impacted culture. Britain changing underneath the very ground that they stand on. As a result, at least in part, the UK says no more with the European Union. Not long after that, Donald Trump is elected president of the United States, largely backed upon similar themes, resting on the issue of immigration. Well, what just happened in Europe this week may give some indication about what may happen in America in 2024. In votes for the European Parliament, almost a third of the votes went to what is described in mainstream press as far-right parties, largely in Italy, France, and Germany. These are parties who take very, very hawkish stands on immigration. CNN writes it up as follows. In June 2024, far-right, their characterization, candidates, many of whom share Trump's populist nationalism, hostility to immigrants, searing economic message, and disdain for governing elites and global institutions, just won sweeping gains in EU elections. More on that framing from CNN in just a moment, because it's important when we understand this issue or all issues, the manipulation of language. But let's stay on the issue of what is motivating voters in the European Union. There is a writer for the Wall Street Journal who analyzed this election and came back with the idea that far-right parties are dominating based upon immigration. His name is Tom Gara, and he tweeted, "It's very scary that in basically every Western democracy, immigration politics is powering a massive far-right surge." Again, his characterization. "And nobody on the non-far right seems to have any idea how to deal with it." Then provides an exception. Australia has almost completely skipped this trend, but I think they did it by taking immigration off the table politically via bipartisan immigration agreement that involves sending asylum seekers to a Guantanamo-style offshore detention island, which is very grim. Now, to that, Ryan Gadurski, who is a conservative commentator and writes often on European politics, posted a response, which I found absolutely fascinating. It's a little long, but I want to share this with you because it helps us understand what's happening in Europe. He says, this is not true in response to Tom Gara. He says, one country stopped the surge of the quote-unquote far right, Denmark. Yes, Denmark's famous socialist government lost control of parliament just after 9/11 as fears of Islamic terrorism swept the globe. For the first time in a century, Denmark elected a right-wing government with the quote-unquote far-right Danish People's Party being the third largest party in the country. I'm not just giving you a history on European politics. This is going to point to the motivating issue of people, not just in Europe, but in America. Gadurski goes on. From 2001 to 2011, and again from 2015 to 19, the DPP was able to support a coalition government that moved Denmark into being the furthest right-wing Nordic country in Europe. That all changed in 2019 when the left-wing Social Democrats retook parliament and the DPP nearly lost all their seats. So how did the left do it? How did Social Democrats win in Denmark? He answers that question. The left-wing Social Democrats said that Denmark was not a dumping ground for the world's migrants. They adopted most of the DPP's policies on immigration, including breaking up Muslim ghettos and deportation of Syrian refugees. In 2022, the Prime Minister's party celebrated for the overall reduction of refugees in Denmark. It's now been 5 years, and the Social Democrats are still in power because of their refusal to allow the world to flood Denmark the same way other countries have flooded Sweden and Germany. What he's pointing out is Europe hasn't lurched to the right. We're not here to pass judgment on whether or not Europe should lurch to the right. What we're doing is we're diagnosing why Europe lurched to the right. And he's saying it's largely based upon one single issue: immigration, the loss of jobs, the rise in crime, the loss of culture across Europe. And that's what you're seeing take place in places like Italy, in France, and Germany. It's what you saw happen in Britain in 2016 and what you saw happen in America in 2016. Is it what we will soon see again in America in 2024? Well, before that question is answered, this election will attempt to be pivoted away from the issue that every poll suggests Americans care about, which is immigration. It will, the left and the mainstream media will attempt to make this election largely about two things: abortion and the threat of authoritarianism. I told you yesterday that I sat on a plane this weekend next to a lady that watched MSNBC for 2 hours, and I was shocked at the world that they lived in. Everything was as though Donald Trump was about to turn America into Nazi Germany. And that is echoed, by the way, in people like Rachel Maddow. On CNN, Rachel Maddow gave a Q&A to one of the biggest hacks in media, Oliver Darcy. I want to read you some of what they had to say back and forth. Darcy asks Maddow, Trump and his allies are openly talking about weaponizing the government to seek revenge against critics in the media and politics. They're even talking about jailing their fellow Americans. Again, no sense of self-awareness or irony, as they literally just went through a trial to jail Donald Trump. You're one of the most notable critics on television, pointed at Maddow. Are you worried you could be a target? You have to hear this answer from Rachel Maddow. I'm worried about the country broadly. If we put someone in power who openly allows that he plans to build camps to hold millions of people and to, quote, root out what he's described as subhuman terms as, quote, the enemy from within. Again, history is helpful here. He's not joking when he says this stuff, and we've seen what happens when people take power proclaiming that kind of agenda. She says, I'm worried, yes, about him jailing her, but I'm only as much as I'm worried about all of us, that Donald Trump's going to jail the left. Well, I was curious when I read that. Like, on what grounds do they make these claims that Donald Trump is a reincarnation of Adolf Hitler? That's clearly what they're alluding to. In fact, it's not an illusion. I can read to you what they're saying, because I was like, let me see what they're talking about. What is this root out that they keep talking about? So I found an article, again, from CNN, where they pinpoint the origins of root out. And here's what Donald Trump had to say. It was in a speech in New Hampshire. He said, quote, "We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country." Now, there's some strong language, clearly, but what's he talking about rooting out? Communism, Marxism, and fascism within the confines of our government. I think if you polled the American public, you give an overwhelming majority to say, yeah, I'd like to root that out of government. Is that the words of Hitler? People point out him saying vermin. Well, he's calling communists, Marxists, and fascists vermin. I mean, isn't that something that we've said for a century in the United States of America? That that's an ideology that represents a threat to our country? They point out that he was talking to the National Pulse, and he says, undocumented migrants are poisoning the blood of our country. It's so bad, people are coming in with disease. I'll go on to quote more from CNN. Trump's chilling rhetoric and use of vermin in particular set off comparisons between the ex-president and the fascist dictators of the 1940s, Mussolini, Hitler. But when you hear it in context, when he's talking about illegal immigration, when he's talking about rooting out fascists and Marxists and communists, is that what you're alluding to? Is that what you are going to have a fevered pitch that we're all headed for the Handmaid's Tale and the pokey? All the lefts are going to end up in the clink? Is that the evidence on which you're painting this dystopia? How about enemy within? This is from MSNBC. They quote President Trump. Here's the quote. "We have the enemy from within, And we have the enemy from the outside. Interesting. Both. That's not what Rachel Maddow pointed to. She said the dangerous language was enemy within. So let's read them again. We have the enemy from within, and we have the enemy from the outside. And I'm telling you, we are more in danger from the enemy from within. With these lunatics, these fascists, these communists, we're going to stop that also. Lunatics, fascists, and communists within. That's the type of thing that we have a conversation about openly here on the Will Cain Show. Is the biggest existential threat to America climate change? Or is it civil war from people who've lost sense of what it is to be an American, our identity, our culture? And this is how they build this dystopia. So let's go back to the CNN characterization of what's happening in Europe. I want you to listen to the words because language is what matters. In June 2024, far right, that's key now. Describe your opponent as far right because anything far is bad. It's extreme. Many of whom share Trump's populist nationalism. Okay. Populist nationalism. Should you believe in America? Should you pay attention to what's popular within the public? Hostility to immigrants. Hostility. We don't want illegal immigration. Searing economic message. No idea what that means. Searing economic message. But it's supposed to be bad. That's the picture that were painted. And disdain for governing elites and global institutions. Disdain is also negative. Everything negative and bad. Just won sweeping gains in the EU elections. Language is everything, folks. I want to show you just, if you can manipulate language, you can manipulate brains. If you can manipulate brains, you can manipulate reality. You guys see the story about these two teenagers who've been charged with a felony for riding scooters over a trans flag painted in a cross section. And then maybe they burned it out or left some skid marks. But I want you to remember, this is in the same context of there were just pro-Hamas protesters desecrating a statue in the United States of a Revolutionary War hero, spray painting it, chunking bottles at park rangers attempting to protect the monument. Nothing, no charges. But 3 teenagers burn out on a trans flag painted in a crosswalk, and they're charged with felonies, these teenagers. And then the scooter company, because it was one of these deals where you rent the scooters, public transport, Lime. This is what Lime had to say. Now, I want you to remember, language is what we're talking about. All of us at Lime condemn these vile acts in no uncertain terms. At a time when our teams at Lime are beginning pride celebrations around the globe, it's disturbing to see the hate that takes place in Spokane, Washington. We will not let a hateful few spoil the joy of Pride Month in Spokane. A hateful few, 3 teens on scooters riding over your new high religious symbol, the trans flag, painted on a crosswalk, is a vile act, according to Lime. Control language, control brains, and then you can control reality. But despite their best efforts, reality is intruding. Unless they can turn this into a dystopian Handmaid's Tale where Donald Trump's going to lock up everybody who's ever disagreed with, including Rachel Maddow, they're going to have to deal with reality, and it's already coming home to roost in Europe. People care about their country, even if you call it nationalism. They care about their culture, they care about their jobs, and they care about crime. And they're not wrong to do so, no matter how outrageous you may feel. And so when Donald Trump talks about deporting illegal immigrants, all they're left with, for example, on CBS, is now not just looking down on Donald Trump, but looking down on you, the voter. Because everything shows you, like French, like the Italians, like the Germans, care about crime, care about your jobs, care about your culture, and care about illegal immigration. Listen to this clip from CBS's Margaret Brennan.
62% of Americans favor deporting all undocumented immigrants. So Homeland Security says that President Biden has already deported or repatriated more people in the past year than any year since 2010. And then, depending on the details of what's talked about on the campaign trail, some of what Mr. Trump talks about could be illegal. It doesn't seem practical in some sense to round up children. And then we know that the courts have questioned whether local authorities would have the ability to do it. And federal authorities don't have the resources. So what exactly do people think they're supporting?
There she goes. Can't believe that almost 70% of you, like the Europeans, care about your country, care about the laws, and care about preserving America.